And now I request Prachi to introduce the keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran.
My absolute pleasure to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran. Dr. Nageswaran again needs no introduction. He's the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Prior to joining the Ministry of Finance, Dr. Nageswaran had a distinguished career in academics, public policy, and wealth management. He was Dean of the IFMR Graduate School of Business and a distinguished visiting professor of economics at Kriya University. He is also a co-founder of the Takshila Institute, which is a think tank for research and education and public policy. Prior to his career in academics and public policy, Dr. Nageswaran has held several senior roles in wealth management. He served as the country economist at the Union Bank of Switzerland, was head of research and investment consulting in Credit Suisse, private banking in Asia, and was global chief investment officer at Bank Julius Baer. Dr. Nageswaran is really a prolific reader and writer. He's co-authored several books. One of his recent books delves into the economics of derivatives, jointly written with Dr. T.V. Somanathan, the current Cabinet Secretary to the Government of India. He was a regular columnist for The Mint. The columns, I can say, were extremely popular for the insights they offered. I have personally been constantly interacting with Dr. Nageswaran over the last several years in his role at the Department of Economic Affairs. His clarity of thinking, his drive to bring new energy and analytic thinking into the Department of Economic Affairs, and I must say his seamless interpersonal skills are really invaluable assets not only to the Government of India but the entire economic policy ecosystem and academic community in India. Without further ado, on behalf of the Ashoka community, I would really like to warmly welcome Dr. Anantha Nageswaran and invite you, Ananth, to offer the keynote speech. And thank you so much for taking out the time, and we are really looking forward to your insights in the keynote.
Shri N.K. Singh sir, Mr. K.P. Krishnan, Mr. Ajit Isaac, Professor Sumak Roy Chowdhury, my friend Tarun Bajaj, former Revenue Secretary, Dr. Prachi Mishra, Director of the ISEC Center for Public Policy, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I am happy about the start of this Center for Public Policy. Given our size, breadth, complexity, and plurality of interests, priorities, and issues at all levels of society, economy, and policy making, we will never run out of the need for such institutions. It's amazing that despite its size and copious demand, China managed to create excess capacity in several areas. India has never managed to do so. If anything, capacity created at any time or anywhere finds itself inadequate within a short period. There you go. That itself is an area that demands your and our attention. Well, I'm digressing so early in this speech. That is not good. So let me come back to the new center. It's never going to be redundant or superfluous. It is highly necessary and therefore welcome, and therefore thanks to Ajit and others for initiating this. Mark Twain is supposed to have said, "Those who can do, do, and those who cannot, teach." Had think tanks been there in his time, he probably would have said, "Those who cannot, run think tanks." I am not saying it to run down teaching or academic research into public policy, because I did the former and had a hand in starting one more than a decade ago in this city. I think Mark Twain would have done well on social media because that statement of his lacks nuance. Every action requires a conceptual foundation and scaffolding as well, a theoretical underpinning, if you will, a point of departure or an anchor. So fear not, centers of public policy are indeed necessary and relevant. But a few banana skins to avoid for public policy centers to be central to public policy making in this country. That is what I want to focus on today. The first one is to avoid linear thinking. Life is circular, and so are policies. I don't need to give you examples. Globalization was not a new thing in the 20th century. Its heyday was in the late 19th century. Then it disappeared and came back towards the end of 20th century. Now again, it's on its way out. It is no longer about supply chain efficiencies, but supply chain security. Industries and sectors are now not chosen by markets, but through active policies. They may be called by a different name today, but they're indeed back. Free trade is passé. Trade restrictions are the new fashion. They have more than doubled in the last 4 years than the numbers we experienced in the previous years, including when Trump was president. Fiscal deficits are bad until they are not, especially if you are an advanced economy. You get the drift. The circular nature of life and policy will not be a surprise if only one recognizes and remembers that socio-political context matters. You might shrug your shoulders and think that it is obvious and that you need not have flown me down from Delhi to say this. But equally, ask yourself how much we allowed this awareness to permeate our research, analysis, and conclusions. In recent times, I will only point to a few landmark speeches which recognize the change in context. A speech by the former British Prime Minister, Ms. Theresa May, in 2016. A speech by the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, in April 2023. And more recently, a speech by the French President Macron to the Sorbonne University. These speeches signaled epochal shifts in thinking, in policy making in those countries. One simply cannot afford to ignore them and the tremendous implications they carried and still carry for future policy direction. Those speeches reflected a rather smooth abandoning of previously held sacrosanct views and positions and an embrace of new ones. In that regard, politicians read the tea leaves far better than intellectuals. Well, that seems like another obvious statement. But think about it. How many of us rather easily think the opposite? Worse, how much such thinking is reflected in our work and recommendations. Another seemingly obvious note of suggestion. Please remember that I'm past 60, and in a few weeks, I will be completing 61 as well. So offering unsolicited and gratuitous advice comes with the turf. You have to bear with me. Public policy centers should not start with conclusions. They are what they are, conclusions, and they should come in the end. You can have starting hypotheses. Well, economic theories are all mostly hypotheses. They are points of departure and not destinations, and so are policy recommendations. They follow, but should not precede nor dictate research and analysis. Data and evidence should do that. The two are separate. Not all evidence is data, and nor should it be. Herding is an instinct that is not peculiar to ordinary people. It is an endemic feature of humans in general, and to the extent that intellectuals are humans, they are not exempt from it. Whether it is with respect to climate policies, energy transition, social policies, macroeconomic policies, or let us say, well, inflation targeting, there is a natural impulse to bind oneself to the fashion of the day. If we are to be effective in telling the political class to avoid copycat policies that are detrimental to society in the present and in the distant future, we need to be mindful of the landmine of copycat thinking in our work as well. Loyalty has to be geared towards policy goals and public welfare, optimized over relevant and reasonable horizons, but not to the orthodoxy or the fashion of the day. I spoke earlier about linear thinking, about avoiding linear thinking. As I mentioned, one reason is that, of course, life is circular, as are economic policies. Context dictate them, especially socio-political context. Economic context, in fact, comes second. If we re-examine the context in which the creed of markets are informationally efficient and inflation targeting, the context in which both of these things arose, we will realize that they emerged in the context of the decade of the 70s, a decade of stagflation. Post-World War II, reconstruction was state-led, even in the West. Financial markets and banking were tightly regulated, capital markets were segmented and not integrated. But the proponents of free markets were therefore waiting for an opportunity, and the decade of the 70s presented them with one. In his latest interview or lunch with the FT, Professor Eugene Fama declared efficient markets a hypothesis, not a reality. In the 80s, of course, inflation targeting emerged. Partly, it was a response to the decade of high inflation and economic stagnation in the 70s. It was also an indirect way to keep the pesky labor unions in check, as allegedly apolitical central bankers now responded to wage inflation by raising interest rates, keeping wage increases in check. In other words, whether intended or not, inflation targeting implicitly or explicitly favored capital over labor. One cannot disregard political economy, therefore, in our work. Indeed, if academic research on public policy questions were to be taken seriously for their policy recommendations, the rigor of thinking must be supplemented with awareness of the reality of the political economy. Further, inflation targeting and market efficiency were statements of no confidence in elected politicians and were a testament to the rise of unelected power. In one case, the implicit call was to leave markets alone because they were efficient. Hey, why do markets that are already efficient need to be regulated at all? Leave them alone. That was the subtext. In the other case, inflation targeting, leave the power to set interest rates, an important price in the economy, to an unelected body of experts. They will not be swayed by short-term electoral considerations. The likelihood of fiscal dominance of monetary policy will be reduced, if not eliminated. But it is a different matter that financial market dominance of monetary policy seems an even bigger problem now. 4 decades after what Paul Tucker called unelected power in his book in 2016, it has grown in importance and influence. And it is now worth examining whether the world has become more stable, fairer, or both or less so. The important point is understanding the underlying and the ever-present political economy dynamic. Linear thinking does not allow that to happen. There are 2 more reasons to avoid linear thinking. One is that most things in life are hygiene factors but not positive factors. Second, ceteris is never paribus in real life. These 2 facts are like gospels. One cannot afford to forget them. In turn, they lead to asymmetries, observed and pervasive all around us. That makes policy making especially tricky. A complex problem or a wicked problem. I'll come to that a bit later, but let us remember that asymmetry is everything. Lest I'm accused of plagiarism, Nicholas Nassim Taleb also said that in his book, Skin in the Game. Yes, asymmetry is everything. And let us start with hygiene and positive factors, just to make the point. The intensity of desire or coveting of anything always exceeds the joy derived from actual possession. Second, the intensity of pain and loss always far exceeds the joy of possession. If anything, possessions or blessings are taken for granted. There is no symmetry or equivalence in our reactions to both. On a more mundane plane, for example, a day that begins with a toothache or headache is difficult and miserable, but the absence of it the following day does not bring proportionate joy or relief. Why? Other things don't remain unchanged. That's the real reason. Ceteris is never paribus. This has huge implications for policy making. This leads to unintended consequences, and policy research must be ever mindful of that. Let me share a few asymmetries in the policy space or economies in general. In investing, low risk means low returns, but high risk can also mean low returns. Taxing capital lightly may not bring more of it, or it may not create jobs, but taxing capital heavily will mean capital flight and destruction of jobs. Deregulation may not create economic activity and employment, but over-regulation will surely crimp both. High interest rates will restrain growth and inflation, but low interest rates may not stoke either of them. Political consultation may not result in achieving consensus and acceptance of reforms, but the absence of it will surely lead to resistance. Trust in governance may not mean more investment, but distrust will surely mean underinvestment by the private sector. Ease of doing business may not mean faster economic growth, but if doing business is hard, it will hurt growth. Treating workers fairly may not win their loyalty, but treating them badly will earn their disloyalty. And more generally, in real life, hard work may not mean success, but laziness raises the prospect of failure significantly. And last but not the least, money cannot buy happiness, but lack of it is surely unhappiness. Among these asymmetries, let's examine, for example, the fact that high interest rates will curb inflation and growth, but low interest rates may not stoke either of them. That is quantitative easing. Since this evening is about public policy, let's discuss what happened post-quantitative easing and also in Japan since the 1990s. Why didn't inflation pick up despite copious amounts of money printing? Or for that matter, why did investment or gross fixed capital formation in advanced societies not pick up post-2008 financial crisis? If central banks can curb inflation by raising interest rates, why could they not stoke inflation by dropping rates to the floor or in some cases even below zero? The asymmetric effect or ineffectiveness, if you will, comes from the fact that other things do not remain the same. When rates were dropped too low, expectations changed. Households and businesses feared the worst. Did the central bankers know more than what they were letting on? Therefore, long-term capital was not committed in response to low interest rates. It was far easier to accumulate speculative assets than to invest for the long term. Further, when a short-term policy tool, namely interest rates, were deployed seemingly interminably, the behavioral response the behavioral response also never changed. It only bred speculation and not capital formation. Hence the big decline in productivity in developed economies that data have now revealed. Interestingly, there is one more asymmetry that QE policies never considered. There was a Federal Reserve discussion paper published in December 2013 that showed chief financial officers of companies will always raise their hurdle rate for making new investments when policy rates went up, but they did not lower the hurdle rate when policy rates were brought down. So, in a situation of low or declining or stagnant growth, when rates were dropped, hurdle rates never came down or did so rather reluctantly, if at all. As a result, real investments did not materialize post-2008 crisis, but speculation did and still does. But then that is another story for another day about speculation. Policy making, next point, policy making is nothing if not about trade-offs. Researchers will be doing their job well if they draw the attention of policymakers to trade-offs. One instance where the trade-offs were ignored in the world in general was during COVID. Academic researchers, with few exceptions, came up short. The Great Barrington Declaration was an honorable exception. Public health policy had to be made by policymakers and not epidemiologists. It might tickle you to know that the Johns Hopkins University Center for Health Security held a conference in September 2019, 5 months before the pandemic officially was declared, on the preparedness for a high-impact respiratory pathogen pandemic in September 2019. Yes, you heard that right, 5 months before the real pandemic broke out. And their recommendations in that report were, I quote, in determining whether and how to implement non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, countries must assess each proposed measure on the following dimensions. Epidemiologic assessment, do available data or experience suggest a specific NPI will work to prevent or slow transmission in a meaningful way? Logistical assessment, is the particular NPI measure feasible given available resources? Number 3, Social, economic, and political assessment. What are the possible unintended adverse social consequences of a particular non-pharmaceutical intervention? These were enjoined upon the policy makers in the September 2019 report, but the world did not pay heed to any of these proposals made in this report, and therefore is still paying the price in terms of lost years of schooling, education, neglected illnesses, and lower life expectancy, etc. In general, the belief is that in economics, humans do not make systematic errors. That is the bedrock of rational expectations theory, and that has been belied in one respect, in our continuous refusal to recognize trade-offs. Of course, there is a counter-argument that the refusal to recognize trade-offs is deliberate, and we can ponder over that sometime later. But it is also now repeated. What happened in COVID is now repeated in how the world approaches the net zero or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions at all cost. I have two recommendations to make for the August audience here and for the library at the ISEC Center. One is The Material World by Ed Conway, and the other book is Climate Change Isn't Everything by Mike Hume of Cambridge University. In an essay he wrote for Outlook Business in India recently based on his book, Mike Hume observes, and I quote, "It is inevitable that there will be trade-offs between different sustainable development goals, SDGs, and between the SDGs and achieving net zero. Not everything can be secured, and certainly not everything can be secured simultaneously and to a prescribed timetable. Win-win solutions only go thus far. Several of the SDGs, for example, eradicating poverty, securing quality education, ensuring decent work and economic growth, will require the expansion of affordable and reliable energy services for billions of people, not least in Africa and South Asia, as Osin Barjo observes. The problem with the ideology of climatism is that exploring these trade-offs is short-circuited by placing net zero above all other goals. Goal pluralism offers a more robust strategy because it allows and finds ways of aligning different and otherwise non-aligned political interests. So, the recognition of trade-offs has another new name, goal pluralism. Before concluding, I am taking the liberty of sharing a few practical suggestions for your consideration. The engagement between academia and policymakers must become mainstream and deeply entrenched in policymaking. I hope that institutions like the ISEC Center, with its highly prolific academic faculty and leadership, can help us inch closer to addressing this critical lacuna. First, given that the center is specifically focused on public policy, I highly encourage each of you to write with specific policy makers in mind. Connecting research with policy often requires some amount of translation. Policy makers and their staff are expected to react quickly to news cycles, perceive policy windows, however small, and demands from constituencies. They often lack the time to read long documents with detailed backgrounds, technical and contextual information. Highlights and summary pages that avoid academic and disciplinary jargon and focus on the meaning and implications of the research can go a long way towards directing and keeping a policymaker's attention. Second, share your research findings in outlets that are accessible to policymakers and their staff. Although valued in appointments, tenure, and promotion processes, articles in academic journals are not a common source of information for policymakers. Content paywalls act as additional barriers to them. Social media can be an effective way to engage with policymakers. Posts that provide links to high-level findings and recommendations and drawing connections between research and issues currently in the news or on the legislative agenda are of particular interest to policymakers and can lead them to your work. Third, you must know your audience. Identify potential consumers of your research by studying the policymakers with whom you wish to communicate. Review their websites and press releases, their Twitter handles, national and local news sources, and government databases with information about past and pending legislative proposals to understand who is engaged with the issues related to your research. When communicating research, highlight data, findings, or stories that directly link to a policymaker's interests and constituencies. They do want to know what research says about a given issue and what needs to change or what action should be taken to address them. Data specific to their state or district may be particularly helpful in enticing them or drawing them to your work. Finally, the goal of a Center for Public Policy has to be to make a difference for the better to public welfare. For public policy is about public welfare. To make a difference, one has to be taken seriously by those who have a skin in the game of public policy. Politicians have skin in the game more than bureaucrats, and bureaucrats have skin in the game more than public policy intellectuals. Therefore, to make a difference, you have to ask and answer the question of what your skin in the game of public welfare is. Skin in the game means failure has to hurt. It is time to close my address. I am very happy to be here at the inauguration of the ISEC Center for Public Policy. I am thankful for the opportunity to share my thoughts, and given the complexity of the world India will face in the coming quarter century or longer, we need many more such centers. India's stock of challenges is formidable. Equally, the flow of progress is impressive. In the journey to the goal of becoming a nation that facilitates the realization of the aspirations of millions of Indians, we need to recognize the latter while dealing with the former. Happy to have the ISEC Center for Public Policy as a co-passenger and co-pilot in this journey. Congratulations to the visionary goal of Ajit Isaac and Ashish Dhawan, and to the Dean and to the Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University, to Prachi, and my best wishes for a successful, fruitful, and purposeful contribution to public policy by the Center in the decades to come. Thank you very much.
So then can I request the Chancellor of Ashoka University, Professor Rudranshu Mukherjee, to please come up on stage and felicitate Dr. Nageswaran.
My name is Nurain Fazal. I'm an educationist. I'm also a member of the Bangalore Political Action Committee. Quick question, how best does one engage with politicians and on policy making, particularly given they're more driven by vote bank politics and don't necessarily see us as people who can contribute towards that? Any thoughts on that, please? Thank you.
I think while we know that in a democracy, politicians do have limited tenures and re-election is always on their minds, therefore goal empathy and goal understanding is the first step. And therefore, in order to make sure that your goals, which are probably more long-term in nature and aligned with public welfare or public interest, has to be packaged and tailored in such a manner that it is not inconsistent with their goals as well. You have to understand that, like any professional, they also are there interested in further progress. So to view that almost as an anathema or as something like a problem or a bug to be rectified or removed is a wrong starting point. The second way to engage with them is also to appreciate the fact that politics is an entrepreneurial venture. The failure rate is very high. And therefore, those who take up politics actually have to have a much higher degree of risk tolerance, and they in fact have to have a much higher degree of connect with the ground reality than academicians and intellectuals have. And therefore, to respect their intelligence and their awareness of issues is equally important to be able to connect with them. And the third is therefore to package our research and our work and our conclusions and present them in a manner that doesn't appear as though we look down upon them or treat them as just necessary evils with whom we have to deal with. I think if we start with these three fundamental premises and also be aware of this paper that was written in 1973, which I think is very important for students of public policy, a paper called, a very blandly titled paper called A Generalized Theory of Planning by Rittel and Weber, published in 1973. Ideally speaking, the paper should have been titled Public Policy is a Wicked Problem. And if you understand why public policy is a wicked problem, then I think there will be a far greater sensitivity to the challenges that either a bureaucrat or a politician faces. And in that case, our engagement will not only be constructive, but also will be fruitful, both from their goal and our goal compatibility. Thank you.
We have one more question. One more question from the behind.
Hello, I'm Dilip Thakur, editor of Education World magazine. Sir, I wanted to ask you a question. Perhaps it's too basic really, but perhaps you can throw some light on the subject. Why, when it's well known that no country has ever attained developed nation status without paying high importance and allocating sufficient resources for education, this has not happened in India for the last 75 years. Our spending on education has never exceeded 4% of GDP, when in fact it was suggested way back in 1967 by the Kothari Commission that it should be 6%. But it's never happened. And perhaps how do we influence a Center for Public Policy to address this very important deficiency in the national development effort?
No, I thought if your question is about how to influence the Center for Public Policy, I would ask Tachi to answer that question. But I thought if your question is about how to, get the policymakers' attention to raise the education outlay, the answer is that if you look at combined expenditure of center and state governments, with respect to education, we are almost already at 6% of GDP. And secondly, it is seldom the case, I'm not saying it is not the case, it is seldom the case that only outlays guarantee outcomes. And for example, it is not as though we have not made progress. That's why I referred to the distinction between the stock and flow. The stock of challenges is high, but the flow of progress is important to acknowledge. For example, 10, 12 years ago, you and I would have been extremely concerned with the low enrollment ratios in schools and colleges. But today, enrollment ratios are no longer, enrollment rates are no longer an issue. And especially if you look at rural India or look at all castes, backward, SC, ST, minorities, etc., enrollment actually has been picking up very, very fast. And rural India in 2000, for example, only 2.4% of men and women in the age bracket of 15 to 29 were enrolled in higher education. Today, that proportion is 10.8%. Only 17.9% were enrolled in higher secondary schools. Now it is 42.3%. So, and if you look at the tertiary enrollment ratio overall in the country was 6.7% in 2000. Now it is 28.3%. And the ratio of enrollment between women and men, which was 77 to 100, it is now 97 to 100. So we have made progress. But now it is important to focus on learning outcomes, the presence of children, presence of teachers before children in classrooms, etc. And these are all problems that do not necessarily require higher outlays per se. So outlays matter, but we should not overstate their importance.